I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 81 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Natural Resources. Pursuant to the order of reference of Tuesday, October 17th, 2023, and the motion of Wednesday, December 13th, 2023, the committee is commencing consideration of Bill C-49, an act to amend the Canada, Newfoundland and Labrador Atlantic Accord Implementation Act and the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Resources Accord Implementation Act, and to make consequential amendments to other acts. Regarding the committee study of Bill C-49, I would like to remind members that all amendments, including sub-amendments, must be submitted in writing and sent to our committee clerk. Should you wish to propose amendments during the clause-by-clause consideration, please send the Legislative Counsel, Mary Danick, your written instructions as soon as possible. She will ensure that amendments are drafted in the proper legal format. Since today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format, I would like to make a few comments for the benefit of members and witnesses. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you're not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. Although the room is equipped with a powerful audio system, feedback events can occur. These can be extremely harmful to interpreters and cause serious injuries. The most common cause of sound feedback is an earpiece worn too close to a microphone. We therefore ask all participants to exercise a high degree of caution when handling the earpieces, especially when your microphone or your neighbor's microphone is turned on. In order to prevent incidents and safeguard the hearing health of interpreters, I invite participants to ensure that they speak into the microphone into which their headset is plugged in, and to avoid manipulating the earbuds by placing them on the table away from the microphone when they are not in use. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. Additionally, screenshots or photos of your screen is not permitted. With us today, welcome the Honourable Jonathan Wilkinson, Minister of Energy and Natural Resources. And with Minister Wilkinson, we have members from the Department of Natural Resources, Michael Vandergriff, Deputy Minister, Aaron O'Brien, Assistant Deputy Minister, Fuel Sector, Abigail Lixfeld, Senior Director, Renewable and Electrical Energy Division, Energy Systems Sector, and Annette Tobin, Director, Offshore Management Division, Fuel Sector. Mr. Wilkinson, the floor is yours for 5 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the invitation to be here to answer some of the committee's questions on Bill C-49. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered on the unceded traditional territories of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. The legislation in question is an important one for Atlantic Canada's economic future and for our country's future as we work to reduce emissions, build out our electrical grid, create sustainable jobs, supply our allies with secure long-term sources of energy, and compete in global energy markets. Cette législation crée le
It creates the legislative framework for moving the offshore wind market forward in Canada so that we, too, can participate in a $1 trillion global market that will grow rapidly. We jointly developed this legislation with the governments of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador and engaged in consultation with stakeholders, including industry, fishers, energy workers, and conservationists.
Businesses and governments around the world are moving rapidly to seize the tremendous economic opportunities that will come from a transition to a low-carbon future, influenced in no small part by the rapid pace of international financial investments seeking low-emission products and sectors to maximize long-term gains. The executive director of the International Energy Agency said, and I quote, "The transition to clean energy is happening worldwide and it is unstoppable. It is not a question of if, it is just a matter of how soon. And the sooner, the better for all of us. Governments, companies, and investors need to get behind clean energy transitions rather than hindering them," unquote. Colleagues, today this committee has been entrusted with an opportunity to help Canada build a vital piece of our energy future, an offshore wind industry. At the present moment, 45% of all offshore wind production globally is in China. Among friendly countries, we are seeing large-scale deployment in the North Sea and more recently along the U.S. East Coast, which the DOE estimates will attract $12 billion in direct investment annually. Presently, there are over 40 projects in the U.S. offshore and hundreds more globally that are underway. There is also extensive deployment occurring globally from Taiwan, which is installing over 700 turbines in the Taiwan Strait by 2025, to European countries, including the Netherlands, Denmark, and the United Kingdom, where they have, as I say, over 300 projects in development. They have presently brought online 4.2 gigawatts of new regional capacity in 2023 and raised an additional 30 billion euros of investment for 8 additional wind farms. The global race for investment and opportunity is well underway, and Canada must not be left behind. Canada's East Coast has some of the world's greatest wind resources, which is why companies around the world have expressed interest in developing clean energy in Atlantic Canada's offshore. It is why Nova Scotia and Newfoundland Labrador's governments have been very clear that they wish to seize this opportunity, and they have partnered with the federal government to do so. Premier Furey stated, quote, Newfoundland and Labrador is perfectly positioned in the green energy transition. We continue to support the Government of Canada on Bill C-49 and urge the other federal parties to do the same. And Nova Scotia Premier Tim Houston stated, quote, Bill C-49 is a necessary first step in unlocking our energy potential. There will be many steps along the road, but we are hopeful that Bill C-49 passes so that we can get started. Nos partenaires provinciaux comprennent.
Our provincial partners understand the urgency of the matter, and they know that the global offshore wind industry is a huge economic opportunity. It represents a generational economic opportunity to generate huge amounts of affordable, clean power while creating thousands of good, sustainable jobs in coastal communities across these provinces.
Engaged with on this legislation and associated regulations, and we are confident that the development of offshore renewables will create opportunity without compromising the economic prosperity of fishing communities. The Public Policy Forum has said that just one area off of Nova Scotia could power 6.5 million homes and create 30,000 construction jobs. To seize this opportunity, we simply must pass C-49. In fact, in order to release their first call for bids in pursuit of their target of licensing 5 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, Nova Scotia needs the Parliament of Canada to pass this legislation swiftly. Let me provide a brief overview of what the amendments under C-49 would do. They would principally expand the two boards' mandates to include the regulation of offshore renewable energy, modernize land tenure, including consultations with Indigenous peoples, and make accommodations that support treaty and Indigenous rights. Garantir que les offices
ensure that offshore boards are able to proceed in alignment with Canada's international marine conservation and biodiversity commitments through modernized consultation and regulatory tools. And they would also align the Accords Acts with Canada's Impact Assessment Act.
Essential legislation that the Government of Canada has carefully developed with our provincial partners at every stage of the process. The Conservative Party has a choice in front of it: drop their opposition and help Canada create thousands of jobs and economic opportunities, or continue to delay, essentially saying they wish to leave this opportunity to Europe, China, and others. Drop their opposition and come into line with the governments of Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia, including Nova Scotia's Conservative Premier. Stop the increasing drift of the Conservative Party into climate denialism. They should end the approach that they have adopted towards climate change, which is simply to let the planet burn, and which will leave Canada far behind in terms of economic competitiveness and growth. I look forward to discussing C-49 further with you today.
Thank you, Minister Wilkinson, for your opening remarks. We'll now proceed to our rounds of questioning. We'll start with Shannon Stubbs from the Conservative Party for 6 minutes. Go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Appreciate that. Minister, Happy New Year. Thanks for being here. On what date will your government bring forward legislation to fix Bill C-69, which has been unconstitutional for half a decade?
When you say Bill C-69, which of the three laws are you? Which of the three laws are you referring to?
Half-decade-old unconstitutional Impact Assessment Act.
So the Impact Assessment Act. Okay. So we will, as we've said, we will be bringing forward targeted amendments within the next number of months to address.
108 days ago, the Supreme Court ruled that the Impact Assessment Act is largely unconstitutional. So on what
Well,
date?
that's not what the Supreme Court said.
It absolutely
No, that's
did,
not
if
what the
you'd like
Supreme
me to
Court said.
read every
But
clause
what we
of
have
every
said is we
section that it
respect the
declared
decision of the
unconstitutional.
Supreme Court, and we will be bringing forward targeted amendments in the next few months.
On what date?
In the next few months.
Here's why I'm asking you that question, Minister, because first of all, the Supreme Court ruling that major sections of C69 was largely unconstitutional was 108 days ago. So as the Minister for Natural Resources, it's actually shocking that you have not yet fixed the legislation, which is the backbone for regulatory review and decision-making for investments in traditional oil and gas development and in alternative renewable energy development. And in the whole swath of your constitutional overreach in C69, that bill that Conservatives warned you would be unconstitutional, and all the very factors that the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that you haven't yet fixed. It's shocking that it's 108 days ago.
Is there a question in there, or is that just a statement?
In a few months. There sure is. This is why I'm asking.
Okay.
Because here's C49. I don't know if you've read it. I hope you had. And all these yellow tabs are sections from C69. Every single one of this. Look how many, Minister. So you're coming here telling us, members of Parliament, that we should fast track and pass this bill when it's been 108 days. You still can't give a concrete answer when you're bringing in legislation to fix the mess that you created, and now you want members of Parliament, I guess, to abandon our due diligence. You want Atlantic members of Parliament in the official opposition to abandon their responsibilities to their constituents, to the people of Nova Scotia, to Newfoundland and Labrador, which they will do, which is their right and their due diligence. And you want us to pass a bill that is full of sections that the Supreme Court of Canada has declared unconstitutional. How can you justify that?
Well, as I'm sure you have read the bill, Bill C-49 simply clarifies how the offshore boards will work with the Impact Assessment Agency. It does not concern the decision-making framework that was the subject of the court's opinion. We are confident that the entirety of Bill C-49 can proceed. Any future changes made to the Impact Assessment Act can be reflected in the Accord Acts when necessary to ensure alignment across the statute.
Interesting you would say that, because of course the sections of C-69 which have been declared unconstitutional, which are also the sections in C-49, all have to do with roles and responsibility and timelines of decision making, which is also why we need to do our due diligence on Bill C-49, because what your Bill C-49 does is actually triple the timeline for future regulatory decisions on offshore wind development. So the reality is, after 8 years of this government, you have been hell-bent on killing the energy sector with the prairie provinces as your top target. But that has impacted every province of the country, including Newfoundland and Labrador, who has a higher percentage of their GDP in oil and gas than Alberta does. And you're hell-bent on killing that sector. But the truth is about C-69, not only will it end offshore petroleum drilling, which certainly is your intention, that's what you love to fly around the world announcing, and meanwhile, this bill, as it is written, will hinder and hamper investment in alternative renewable and wind shore development because they require certainty, predictability, fairness, and efficient timelines. And you want this bill to be passed fast-tracked with all the timelines, all the red tape, and all the inefficiencies from C-69 in it, and won't even give a date of when you're going to fix that bill.
Well, with due respect, you say it's tripling timelines. I mean, there is no regulatory structure in place to enable the development of offshore winds. That's the whole point of the bill. I would also say that this was developed in lockstep with the governments of Newfoundland, Labrador, and Nova Scotia, including the Conservative Premier of Nova Scotia. It is a bill that will enable enormous economic opportunity for those provinces.
So
it will move forward.
We have a point of order from Mr. Bruson. Mr. Bruson on the point of order.
Ask that there's time given so that we can actually hear the answers, because right now Ms. Stubbs keeps on talking over the minister and it's impossible to actually hear the answers.
Colleagues, as you ask a question, please allow the minister time to a reasonable amount of time to respond to your question that you've brought forward. So I'd ask everybody to ask your question, and please give the minister enough time so he can give a response without interrupting him. Okay. And we can have a smooth meeting with that if we all stick by those rules.
Okay,
Minister Wilkinson was in the middle of answering Ms. Stubbs.
On the current legislation, the federal minister has 30 days to respond to a recommendation from the regulator on offshore oil development. Under your bill in C-49, a minister, and it's good that you have the provincial minister included, we support that. Under your bill, That will be 90 days. That's the tripling of the timeline. Not only that, the same powers exist in C69 for the timeline to be extended for any reason at any time of the minister's discretion. That uncertainty is exactly what has killed foreign investment in Canada and energy development in Canada of traditional sources. And it's exactly the kind of approach that will also kill renewable, alternative, and wind offshore opportunities for Atlantic Canadians.
Well, I would just say to you, first of all, this is focused on renewable energy, not on oil and gas development.
I just said renewable and alternative energy.
And this regulatory structure will put in place something that the provinces have agreed to that will allow us to expedite the work that is being done to ensure that Canada actually is keeping up in the world in terms of generation of offshore wind. So this is an important step forward. I will tell you that Premier Houston and Premier Fury are fully supportive of this legislation because it's good legislation that's going to actually create jobs and economic opportunity for both provinces.
Well, forgive Atlantic Canadians for being skeptical and asking you the good questions that they must, since, of course, the track record of your government is actually killing a tidal offshore wind project off the Atlantic Canadian coast, right?
That's not that is in a bay. It's not offshore. There is a distinction. It is under the jurisdiction of the province, not of the federal government. It doesn't relate in any way to the offshore. But certainly tidal energy is an interesting area where there is development ongoing. We've set up a task force to work with DFO and the Nova Scotia government to find pathways through which you can actually have the development of tidal power in a manner that is consistent with the protection of fish and fish habitat.
Thank you, Minister Wilkinson, for your answer, and Ms. Stubbs for the questioning. Time is up. We'll now go to Ms. Jones from the Liberal Party of Canada for 6 minutes. Ms. Jones, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Minister, and your team for being here today. We are starting from a new preface in offshore wind in Atlantic Canada, and it is important that we work and listen to the provinces so that we get this right moving forward. My questions are going to be directly related to Bill C-49, which is the bill we're dealing with. But I do agree with one thing my colleague said, and that is uncertainty will kill development, and that applies in Atlantic Canada as well. And I really hope the Conservatives can find a way to support this bill and to support offshore wind in Newfoundland and Labrador and in Nova Scotia, because it is what those provinces and people are asking for. We know that both Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia has led the way in Canada's offshore oil economy. It has created good jobs and a strong economy in partnership with Ottawa and with Canada. The Atlantic Accord provided the legislative strength that all parties needed to succeed, and now they're ready to develop Canada's first offshore wind project. And I'm very excited about it, as I know the people in my province is. And we know that offshore wind will create good jobs, they will reduce emissions, they will build a new green economy for the future. So, Minister, can you tell us how offshore wind and the important changes that we're making today under Bill C-49 can contribute to Canada's net zero goals, the electrification and decarbonization of Canada's economy, all the while creating opportunities that we need in Atlantic Canada, especially in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador?
Thank you for the question. Certainly, there are enormous economic opportunities. One large-scale project, the Public Policy Forum estimates, would create 30,000 construction jobs and thousands of ongoing direct operating jobs. It would create enough power that you would actually be able to service most of the homes in either of the two provinces. It is important from a decarbonization perspective. In the case of Nova Scotia, it's important to be able to decarbonize the grid. That's a little bit less so in Newfoundland and Labrador, where the grid is very clean already. But certainly as we look to decarbonize industries, to electrify transportation and a whole range of things, it will be very important for us to actually have access to additional power. It also is going to create a hydrogen export industry, domestic and export industry, and certainly we are working very closely with our friends in Germany to enable exactly that.
Actually, if I could follow up, I'd like to ask a question around the clean hydrogen, because how will the legislation that we're looking at now contribute to that clean hydrogen industry that we are trying to kickstart in Newfoundland and Labrador and export to the rest of the world?
Well, it's directly related. Both of the province's hydrogen strategies focus in the short term on onshore wind development for the purpose of producing hydrogen. But their ability to scale the industry actually requires the development of the offshore and large-scale facilities in the offshore. So in order for both of those provinces to essentially succeed in the aspirations they have of building out a large-scale hydrogen industry, which can service domestic consumption that's required for hydrogen, but can be a major exporter, particularly to our friends in Europe, offshore wind is absolutely critical.
If I could have one more question. You mentioned already that you have worked with the government in Newfoundland and Labrador and in Nova Scotia to draft this legislation. I think it's important that you share with the committee as well why you felt that was necessary and what the feedback have been from both those provinces around Bill C-49 and how important it is to the work that they're doing.
Well, it's critically important because the Atlantic Accords are a joint undertaking on the part of the federal government and both of the provinces to do work relating to the offshore together. It is a very interesting piece of architecture in terms of federal-provincial cooperation. The provinces asked us to work on this because they want to see the development of a large-scale industry on a go-forward basis. And I would tell you that both governments have been enormously engaged and enormously cooperative, and every word in this bill has been agreed upon by the province of Newfoundland, Labrador, and the province of Nova Scotia.
Thank you. And just one final question, if I could. Can you share with us why Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia, it's my understanding that they want to see this done as quickly as possible. I think that was alluded to by my colleague opposite. Obviously, they're driving the agenda here. Do you want to share with us why it's so critically important and the timing around it for them?
Well, as I say, the world is moving. Canada is not the only country that is seeking to seize the economic opportunities that can be enabled through a transition to a low-carbon future. We see significant offshore development going on in Europe. We see significant offshore development going on in the United States, in Taiwan, and a range of other countries. If Canada is to be as successful as we hope to be, and the provinces wish to be, we need to actually move with expedience. We need to get into a position where we actually can give comfort to the Germans that we will be able to actually scale the supply of hydrogen that they are going to need within the relevant time frame. And I would also say for industries here, increasingly they are having to, in Canada, they're having to account for the carbon that's embedded in the final products that they sell. And so for us, it is critically important to find pathways through which we can actually ensure that there is abundant clean power that is available in every province and territory in this country.
Okay. Thank you, Minister Wilkinson. We'll now go to Monsieur Simard from the Bloc Québécois for 6 minutes. The floor is yours, sir.
Merci.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Minister, for being here with us today. A little earlier, I was listening to your opening statement in which you stated the transition is already underway and is inevitable. I think we share that opinion, and we certainly back this new transition, contrary to our Conservative colleagues. But to my mind, the transition would involve going from a high-carbon energy source to low-carbon energy sources. We agree on that? Yes? Yeah, that's what it looks like. Yep, transition to a low-carbon energy source. Good. That would involve progressively reducing the production of fossil fuel-based energy, this new transition. C-49 now, what I see here is administrative processes that allow for authorizing new hydrocarbon projects. Is this incongruous? No, not at all. This bill addresses renewable energy. That's the main point, of course. As you know, during a transition, there is a need to continue to use petroleum products, gas and oil, but this use would diminish during the transition. Canada is an important exporter of petroleum products. That said, we are now developing, and we shall continue to develop renewable sources of energy, such as wind farms. All right. It seems, to my mind, that this looks like some sort of eco-laundering. Let me explain. From the title of the bill, we've reduced and taken out the reference to petroleum production in this effort to greenwash the bill. So I think that this is incongruous, inappropriate, and year after year, when I look at the results that we get from various groups following these matters closely, Oil Change International, such example, we see that Canada is not necessarily progressing fast enough. The energy that or the investments in petroleum production is high, and that in renewable energies is not as high as it should be. The government fully relies on the regulators and has confidence in the regulating agencies to organize this transition into the future. It's important to organize a transition. We don't want to reduce the contributions of other regulators. I mean, there are many factors, the costs, the time. We're using the expertise that we now have to move forward correctly. Let's admit, Mr. Wilkinson, that we were just chatting over a beer on a front porch, and I were to show you this bill, asking you what it would apply to. I think it will apply to hydrocarbon projects offshore more than it will apply to wind farms offshore. The regulatory agency is working, of course, with petroleum projects. But this is enlarging their powers so that they can also work on renewable energy projects. All right, if we look at the mandate of the board, we see to facilitate exploration and exploitation of petrochemical resources, of petroleum resources, gas resources. That remains in the current wording of the bill. So I have difficulty seeing how we can consider this to be a step in the right direction, a step in a transition. I don't see much transition here. I think we're just using the offshore wind market as a tool of greenwashing. I don't want to say it's hypocritical, but I think it's just a little overdone, no? Trying to remove the words hydrocarbons from the bill when it still continues to apply to petroleum products. I think, honestly, I'm really sorry, but it looks like greenwashing. Do you agree with me? No, I don't. I think we want to draw on current expertise developed in offshore projects, and we're going to be using the current offshore boards, and we will then expand their powers so that they can also handle renewable energy projects. All right, so in fact, how many wind farm projects are underway at present? There are a few that are onshore in Nova Scotia and in Newfoundland, but we need a regulatory system to allow for them to be built offshore. That's exactly why we're here. In the old version of the bill, this basically it stymied the development of offshore wind markets, yes? Yes, correct. And now we want to make sure that we will be able to create this new industry, this offshore wind industry. To your knowledge, the project promoters, have any come forward? Yes, there are many. And the project that's most advanced is probably that of Everwind. But there's also World Energy's projects, and there are more as well, in both provinces, of course.
Time is up. You can follow that line of questioning in the next round. Thank you, Minister, for your responses. We'll now go to Mr. Angus from the New Democratic Party for 6 minutes. Mr. Angus, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for being back at your most welcome seat, where we'd love to have you. If you want to stay for a few extra hours, I'm sure we would be more than willing to vote on it. My concern is over Christmas we've heard some really disturbing news. Canadian researchers tell us that Greenland ice shelves are melting at 30 million tons an hour. This is planetary breakdown in real time. We have parts of Alberta that are still burning from last summer in January. And yet I hear positive talk from the government, but I don't see the action that I'm seeing elsewhere in the world. I mean, China, in a single year, doubled its solar capacity. It increased its wind capacity 66%. The Biden government brought in $132 billion in clean tech projects in a year. And yet our ITCs are still being talked about. We have Bill C-50 being monkey-wrenched by the Conservatives. We have C-49, and they're sending a signal again on this. So my concern is we have a window. And once that window passes, we're going to be left by the side of the road. The Biden administration in the United States, one clean tech offshore wind project in New Jersey will serve 700,000 homes. One project in Martha Vineyard, 400,000 homes. Rhode Island, 250,000 homes. These are being built right now, and we're talking about it. Why would investors come to Canada?
Well, investors would come to Canada for a whole range of different reasons, and investors are coming to Canada. If you saw the $12 billion Dow investment in the world's first net zero petrochemical facility, if you looked at the world's largest and lowest emission potash mine in Saskatchewan, the battery manufacturing plants and the electric vehicle manufacturing plants in Ontario and Quebec. But I am totally in agreement with you that we need to move fast. We need to move quickly. The world is moving. You are right that the most aggressive on this is China. They've made a major bet on the energy transition, the scale of what they've done with respect to electric vehicles, with respect to the deployment of renewable energy technology, with respect to critical minerals and supply chains. I mean, Canada and other Western countries need to accelerate the work that we are doing. We need to get those ITCs in place, and they will be coming forward very soon in order to actually catalyze even more investment in Canada.
I mean, I look at Aberdeen, the land of my people. This is an oil town. It suffered from the decline. There were 15,000 new jobs alone last year in offshore wind. There's over 42,000 that have been created in Aberdeen. There's huge investments being made in Europe. There's huge investments being made in the United States. I guess I'm asking, like, how long do we keep hoping that they're going to pay attention to us if we're still sitting talking about this legislation, still talking about C-50, still talking about ITCs? That investment is going to go elsewhere.
I think that's exactly right, and that's why getting this bill passed and implemented to have a regulatory structure in place such that people do have the certainty around the regulatory regime is critically important. So, yes, I mean, the kinds of delays that we have seen in this committee have not been helpful to the economic competitiveness of Canada, and we need to actually move forward expeditiously.
One of the things that was really striking, so the Biden administration has made the dealing with the climate crisis and sustainability the #1 job. And yet recently the president decided to put a moratorium on LNG exports because of serious concerns of methane and other carbon bomb damage, that LNG is not clean energy. And he said the pause on new LNG approvals sees the climate crisis for what it is, the existential threat of our time. So is the Liberal government willing to deal with a moratorium on LNG in the way that the Biden administration is saying this is an existential climate threat?
Well, the Americans, it's not a moratorium on exports. It's a moratorium on new projects as they look to actually incorporate climate more strongly into their regulatory approval process. Canada started down that path years ago. Our 75% methane reduction requirements, the requirement for best in class, which means you need to liquefy using electricity, are exactly what the Americans are looking at now, and they have not done it. So we welcome the Americans actually joining Canada in focusing on how do you actually ensure the decarbonization of that sector. I actually was meeting with Premier Eby today. We had exactly that conversation. That's exactly his view as well.
Well, I guess the issue on methane is, I mean, methane's a planet killer. It's 80 times worse than CO2 emissions. And yet we find that, again, emissions are 50% higher than industry has admitted. We simply cannot trust Suncor to tell anybody the truth. We cannot trust the Alberta Energy Regulator, which is an extension of Suncor, to tell the truth. So we have 50% higher emissions. LNG is a major source. So when you say that we've got a plan on methane, how do we have tell the public we have a plan on dealing with methane when what we're getting in terms of how much is actually being emitted by industry is false?
So it's a good question. I think the reductions that we have seen with respect to methane regulations are real reductions. But what you're saying is that the absolute starting point may be different. And I think there has been lots of data that's out there that would suggest that methane emissions are higher than we had previously thought. That is why we've actually announced the Methane Center of Excellence, which is actually going to be a body that is going to look at this. It will be independent of the industry. It will actually ensure that we have in place the appropriate methodology to measure.
Here, I just saying, because methane's a planet killer. So we know it's much higher, and we can't trust industry. I mean, setting up some kind of body to look at it, to me, isn't good enough. We have to say, we have to take what the real numbers are and say, this is what industry has to start dropping. We can't.
You are absolutely right, but you have to actually do the measurement, right? So there are a number of different technologies that have come forward that will allow us, including satellite technology, to be more accurate on the measurement. That's exactly what we are going to be requiring going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Angus and Minister, for answering all the questions. We'll now go to Mr. Perkins for 5 minutes. Mr. Perkins, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister. Just to make sure everybody is clear, because there's a lot of statements been made here, as a Nova Scotia MP and a member of the Conservative Caucus, we support the development of offshore wind if it's economical and works and does not displace existing important industries like our commercial fishery. And we don't support the imposition of the C-69 processes on the development of all offshore energy off of Nova Scotia. And you mentioned and said that the new processes from C-69 that are in this bill only apply to the review of offshore wind. But that's not the way I read the bill or the way most people see the bill. It's a new process for reviewing all offshore energy projects. These two boards will not be following the process that they follow now for offshore oil and gas or for wind. They'll be following the C-69 process. Is that not true through the IAA?
Again, C-69 had 3 pieces of legislation under it. So you are referring then to the Impact Assessment Act and not the Navigable Waters Act and not the Canadian Energy Regulator Act. Okay. So as I have said, the focus of the offshore boards has always been on a process to assess initially hydrocarbon projects. It will now actually be expanded to address renewable energy projects. The process that is being put into place is something that we have worked very closely with Premier Houston, who you would know very well.
I understand that, Minister, but sorry to interrupt. Minister, I only have 5 minutes, and I asked a very specific question. I don't need another explanation on your discussion with the province. I asked a question about whether or not the process that's in C-49 applies to both the oil and gas energy project review process and the offshore wind project, because that's the way the bill reads. And you said it doesn't.
So I didn't say it doesn't. There are some differences, but certainly the way the regulator actually goes through the project approval process will be similar.
Okay, so even before this process, and that process we know has resulted in almost no energy projects being approved since C-69 has been implemented. So you're going to take that and apply it not only to offshore oil and gas, but also that cumbersome and awful process to offshore wind. And even without that, in November, a proposal for an exploratory well off of Nova Scotia was suspended for you after approval by this board and then rejected. And in the 30 days in between in the media, you said in your decision whether or not to veto this, you needed to talk to interest groups like the Sierra Club. Did you talk to anyone else besides the Sierra Club?
Sure, there were a number of different organizations that we talked to, and I certainly talked to my counterpart, Minister Rushton, and we made the decision jointly.
Did you speak with any fishing groups?
There were folks from the fishing community in some of the meetings. Yeah.
So I'd like to take you back, because one of the things this bill does in Section 28, I believe it is is it gives an enormous power to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans to say you cannot do any offshore energy project, any offshore, including wind, if they may be thinking about a marine protected area. And you'll recall when you were fisheries minister, your visit to the Eastern Shore, where 200 lobster fishermen came in to greet you on the area of interest off the Eastern Shore, which you'll recall is this area right here that was set up in 2018. You were about to turn it into a marine protected area at the time, and the objections of the community, because nobody had been consulted, and none of those people have been consulted in any of the offshore wind projects to date, and in the consultation of this bill, they pushed back on you because there had been no socioeconomic stuff, because you were going to impose that in an area where they have few opportunities to make a living other than lobster, mackerel, and herring. And you were going to close it down. Now, you suspended that, but that Damocles sword is still hanging over everybody, and that's what DFO does. And you've given them that power in this bill to stop everything in the ocean that you want to do on offshore energy. Why would you do that?
That's not actually what the bill does. So there is no ability for DFO or for the federal government to create a marine protected area on its own. It requires, under the Accord Acts, agreement on the part of both the province and the federal government. That's part of the structure of the Accord Acts.
It says may.
Thank
it may
you,
be identified. Not
Mr. Perkins.
it is.
You
it
can
may.
identify something as
Without
a
actually
protective
doing the
area.
process.
Thank
but
you, Mr.
can't actually do
Perkins.
it. Yeah.
Thank you, Minister. The time's up, and we'll now move to Mr. Aldag for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Minister, for being here, and officials. It's good to see everybody. I'd like to begin by talking or asking a couple of questions. I'll give you the context for it.
Point
the
of order.
Memorandum of Understanding
order.
between the
Mr. Aldag, can you pause for a sec? We have a point of order from Mr. Angus.
Sorry, it's really hard at this end of the table to hear what's happening because there's constant talk. If people could just, that is absolutely a point of order. If people could just go outside if they want to talk, but I want to hear the questions. Thank you.
So, colleagues, I'll just ask while a member is speaking and has the floor that other members respect that individual's time to ask their question and for the minister to speak. And let's not, if you would like to have a side conversation or if you have a phone call, you can step outside and do that. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Aldag. We'll go back to you. The floor is yours.
Is that from the top? I'll just carry on. So, Minister, what I was saying is that the Memorandum of Understanding that exists right now between the federal government and the province of Newfoundland and Labrador identifies 16 bays as exclusive provincial jurisdiction. And you touched on that in one of the responses to Ms. Stubbs' questions. The legislation that we have before us will allow the province to develop offshore wind farms as though, the province has the ability right now to develop wind farms as though they're on land. That's what I'm trying to say. And then this legislation, passage of C49, is needed to make offshore power production a reality. So, Premier Andrew Furey has said that, and this is a quote, "This crucial federal-provincial agreement puts us in the driver's seat and will allow us to reap the majority benefit from the endless possibilities of the new green economy." That's the end of the quote. So we've seen at this committee some of the stall tactics employed by the opposition, and we decided specifically on Bill C-50, the Sustainable Jobs Act. So I'm wondering if the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador expressed any concerns to you about the passing of this legislation.
It was actually the Liberals who
we have
brought
Mr. Aldag, can you hold
C-49
for a
to this
sec?
committee
We
and
have
put it behind C-50. So the claim that Mr. Aldag has just made is not true. It's the Liberals who delayed C-49 themselves.
No,
just
I
for
did
clarity.
to clarify.
Colleagues, we had a point of order. Thank you, Ms. Stubbs, on the point of order. Mr. Aldag, the floor is yours. Please go ahead and
Thank you. So what I was saying is that given the stall and delay tactics used by the official opposition on Bill C-50, the Sustainable Jobs Act, I'm wondering if the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador has expressed concerns to you about passing this legislation in a timely manner. And secondly, what are the potential impacts of having this legislation delayed by the official opposition?
So, yes, the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador and I have spoken about this. He is very keen to see this actually move forward, as is the Premier of Nova Scotia. to ensure that the planning and the investments that are going to be required on the part of companies like World Energy in Newfoundland and Labrador actually can proceed. But they need to know what the regulatory structure looks like. So he is very keen on that. He is certainly pushing very hard. I suggest that folks from Newfoundland and Labrador might want to have a conversation with him. To be honest, I'd be quite happy if he came and presented at the committee to actually tell you how anxious he is that the committee actually do its job and get this done.
And perhaps, Minister, you could also speak to the point about the...
No, Mr. Aldag, I'll ask you to hold a sec. We have a point of order of Ms. Jones.
Point of information, I'd just like to clarify, Minister, that there is a motion before the committee to hold hearings in Newfoundland and Labrador and in Nova Scotia that have yet to be dealt with. So hopefully we will have that opportunity.
Thank you for the point of order or point of information, which is not a point of order, but thank you for clarifying that. Mr. Aldag, back to you.
Thank you. I was just saying, Minister, if you could perhaps expand a bit. I think you touched on it in your opening comments and in other responses. But you know, what are the potential impacts of having this legislation delayed? You know, we talked a little bit about impacts on investments. Are there other impacts we might see if we do not get this legislation through this committee back to the House and onward sooner than later?
Well, there are impacts. There are impacts in terms of companies being able to plan. There are impacts in terms of investments that they will hold off on. There are impacts in terms of being able to create the certainty that is required for us to engage in an agreement with Germany about the kinds of volumes of hydrogen that we will be able to ship them. So the longer it takes us, the more likely it is that Qatar and the United States and other parts of the world are going to seize this opportunity. We are not the only ones. We are falling behind if we do not actually act expeditiously. And so the delay that we've seen in this committee over the past little while is putting at risk Canada's future economic prosperity.
Thank you. I'm going to turn now to a question on consultation. And this comes as from my role as chair of the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs. And so I am quite curious on consultation. So could you tell us, when consultations took place, what was the feedback from the nations that your ministry talked to, and how strong is Indigenous support for this project, and how can Bill C-49 help advance reconciliation? It's kind of a package of questions there on reconciliation and consultation.
So there are a number of opportunities to engage in consultation with Indigenous communities in both provinces. The first was through a call out that we did with this piece of legislation, but there is also the regional assessment, the environmental assessment being conducted by Environment Canada, where that will also be a venue for engagement with communities, Indigenous communities. And then project-specific environmental assessments, when those come forward, will again provide a venue for engagement with Indigenous communities. I will tell you that beyond just consultation, though, there are many Indigenous communities in both provinces that actually have been very supportive of the project activity, and in fact, many of them are participants from an equity perspective in some of these projects, because they see this as an enormous opportunity from an economic perspective for them to actually have long-term benefits that flow to their communities.
Thank you, Minister. We'll now go to Monsieur Samard for 2.5 minutes. The floor is yours, sir.
Merci, Georges.
Thank you very much, Chair. I remain confused by the following, Honourable Minister. I have carefully examined the matter of hydrogen production, and one of the places that's perhaps privileged for this sector is Quebec, given that we have a high volume of hydroelectricity available, clean hydroelectricity. That said, the government of Quebec has decided not to move on the hydrogen export market linked into its electric grid. There's a principle behind this that I've had explained to me. The energy return on investment issue, we would be investing too much energy to create the hydrogen, and that would lead to a high loss of electricity. It's been explained to me, this taux de retour énergétique in French. I'm not a scientist, but I understand the basic principles. So I'm wondering, in these wind farms that we have in mind, you'll need quite a big capacity, energy capacity, yes, if we want to export hydrogen. Wouldn't it be more logical, more rational and reasonable to use the electricity and use it locally rather than to try to create hydrogen that not in great amounts and that will surely not meet the needs of Germany? I'm not sure whether you follow me on that. Yes, well, here's something. For the province of Quebec, there are hydrogen projects for local use, for domestic use. An announcement was made 3 weeks, about a month ago. Moreover, in Quebec, the government of Quebec has decided that it doesn't have enough electricity right now and that a choice must be made. That choices must be made about how to use the electricity. In Nova Scotia, however, and Newfoundland and Labrador, it is possible to produce, with wind farms, a good deal more electricity than would be needed for the province's needs. So that's what's different from Quebec. So I don't think the volumes are comparable. Nothing can be compared to Quebec's capacity to produce hydroelectric clean energy. I don't think anything compares to that. So you'll have to build a hell of a lot of wind farms to get enough energy to produce something else, because there will be a loss, of course. So to produce the hydrogen, export the hydrogen, let's be clear here. In this bill, are we trying to produce electricity just to produce hydrogen? Or will the provinces themselves have a say in how the electricity is used? Is this to live up to the agreement that you signed with Germany a while ago? Is that what you're aiming for?
No.
All right. The provinces must make decisions, of course, and the businesses as well. The industry itself, what use they wish to make of the electricity. Of course, the electricity can be used locally. However, there are business models that also allow for producing electricity to create hydrogen and to export it.
Minister Wilkinson. We'll now go to Mr. Angus for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. I just want to follow up. The frame of dealing with the need to put a sustainable energy future in place, but also being willing to face the climate damage that is being done in real time. We talked about methane, but we now see this really disturbing new report that says toxic emissions from the tar sands is 6,000% higher than has been reported. Now, it's not surprising that Suncor and Imperial are going to downplay, but 6,000% is a staggering number.
Mr. Angus, I'll ask you to hold for a sec. We have a point of order from Mr. Ellis. Mr. Ellis, go ahead on the point of order.
Thanks very much, Chair. Clearly there's those of us who aren't normally in this committee, and perhaps maybe you don't talk about relevance here much, but Suncor doesn't exist in Eastern Canada. This bill is very specifically about Atlantic Canada. Perhaps that member could get to his point of relevance related to this particular piece of legislation.
Thank you for your point of order, Mr. Ellis. I would ask all members to keep your questions relevant to the conversation at hand today. And I'll go back to you, Mr. Angus.
Well, certainly the relevance is climate denial and obstruction of our bills. So I just want to deal with this issue.
Sorry, point of order again, Chair.
Mr. Angus, we have another point of order. Mr. Ellis on the point of order. Go ahead.
I'm curious. This member keeps talking about climate denial. There's nothing in this bill about that he continues to go on and talk about. So I guess, again, relevance, please.
Thank you, Mr. Ellis. I believe Mr. Angus was just about to get into the rest of his debate, but I will ask members to be relevant, but also not to use point of orders to interrupt other members. Mr. Angus, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. I'm certainly not surprised that when you ask tough questions on this level of pollution that it's going to ruffle a few feathers over there. But I'm asking you, Minister, who is it then who's the Pathways Alliance claims that these emissions standards and measurements are done in conjunction with the federal government. We can understand why Suncor or Imperial would lie about the facts. Why would the federal government allow this to happen?
Well, certainly, and I have not seen that report, although I've certainly heard about it, but Environment Canada would have a role to play in the context of measuring emissions and contaminants, and I am quite certain that Environment Canada is having a look at the report as we speak. I would say, though, to the earlier interjection by the colleague down the way, is Suncor actually does have an interest in the offshore. It is a player in the Newfoundland Labrador oil and gas sector, so it is relevant to this conversation in that regard.
Well, certainly, Speaker, or Mr. Minister, I was aware of that, but sometimes when you get into those kind of side arguments, you're really wasting a lot of mental energy. My concern is that we have an industry that is polluting at 6,000 times higher, and we're being obstructed in getting clean energy off the ground. So I just reiterate the simple question. How important is it that we actually get these projects off the ground, because we are losing competition around the world?
It is enormously important. I mean, at the end of the day, the world is moving. Countries across, around the world, whether it's Japan, South Korea, China, the United States, and various countries in Western Europe, are looking to actually get ahead in terms of the various opportunities that actually exist in the context of the transition to a low-carbon future. That is not exclusively electricity and hydrogen. It's critical minerals and batteries and electric vehicles and a whole range of other things. But certainly, this is an enormous economic opportunity for Newfoundland, Labrador, and for Nova Scotia. It's the reason why both premiers are pushing so hard to actually see this move forward. It's thousands of jobs. It's economic prosperity for communities and for Indigenous communities. I mean, my goodness, it just boggles the mind that the Conservative Party is opposing something like this. I never thought I would see the day when a political party is fully opposed to an economic enabling piece of legislation that is fully supported by the provinces, including the Conservative government of Nova Scotia.
Thank you, Minister. Right on time. We'll now go to Mr. Small for 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll let the Honourable Minister know that the Conservative Party opposes this bill because Bill C-49 breaks the spirit of the original Atlantic Accord, so much so that the Canadian Association of Petroleum,
Point of order?
I'm pleased that I humoured my colleague from Labrador.
Mr. Small, I'll ask you to hold 1 sec. We have a point of order from Mr. Angus.
So the statement that they're officially opposing Bill C-49, is that just his opinion, or is that the Conservative Party? So it helps us understand where we're going with these guys.
So colleagues, hold on, colleagues. Once again, I'll encourage all colleagues to make sure your point of order is a point of order relevant to the conversation, and not make sure we don't use it as debate, but I would also ask all members to stay in line with their questioning. So, Mr. Small, back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I hope that time goes back onto my time, respectfully. So we oppose this legislation. We voted for it. Obviously, we oppose it. And we oppose it because the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers wrote you a letter, and I have it right here. I don't know if you read it. Did you read it in August 8th? Did you read this letter from CAP?
I'm sure I did.
I certainly hope you did, because CAP is concerned that your Section 56 of this bill is going to shut down the oil and gas industry off Labrador. So will you, or off Newfoundland and Labrador, will you remove Section 56 from this bill to address their concerns?
So this bill was negotiated in tandem with the government of Newfoundland and Labrador, which obviously is a significant participant in enabling the offshore energy industry. It is something that we and they are fully comfortable with, and we see the bill as standing as it is. Obviously, subject to the discussion that this committee will have.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. How did you, Mr. Minister, I'd like to know how you hoodwinked the provinces in Atlantic Canada to support this legislation. How did you pull the wool over their eyes?
Well, my goodness, I have a lot more respect for Premier Furey and Premier Houston than perhaps you do. At the end of the day, both of them see this as an enormous economic opportunity. Both of this came to us to actually ask that this be done. Both of them engaged in negotiations on this. So, I mean, I can't speak for them, but I am obviously very shocked that you would actually see them as being that kind of weak in their ability to actually negotiate on behalf of their province.
I don't think they're weak leaders, but Section 56 gives you the unilateral power with the unconstitutional Bill C-69 to create marine protected areas so that you can pull development and exploration permits without an environmental impact study. In 2023, we saw a record 37 parcels of leases that were put forward off at the east coast of Newfoundland and Labrador. How many of those were actually bought?
So industrial development is important. So is the
This is
protection
an
of
easy one.
biodiversity. Biodiversity is in decline
many
around
were
the
bought?
world. It's important that we are actually protecting particularly sensitive areas. I'm not sure why the Conservative Party doesn't believe in the protection of biodiversity. But at the end of the day, you cannot, under this bill, the federal government can't unilaterally create a marine protected area or a marine refuge. It has to be done in conjunction with the province and territory.
Well, how many, you didn't answer the question, Mr. Minister. How many blocks were sold off the east coast of Newfoundland and Labrador in 2023? How many parcels were sold? Out of a record 37 that were offered up, how many?
How many?
I would ask none were sold.
Bingo.
This? Zero?
After 8 years.
It was zero.
Your government.
How many $1 million worth of leases were sold in the Gulf of Mexico in that same year?
I do not know the answer to that question.
The answer? $382 million worth of leases were sold in the Gulf of Mexico. Why would these same oil and gas producers trip over themselves to drill and explore in the Gulf of Mexico and completely walk away from Newfoundland and Labrador's offshore oil and gas industry?
Look, businesses actually make decisions based on the development of the business case, and they would make their own decisions. I'm not going to put myself in the mind of an ExxonMobil or a Shell or anybody else. At the end of the day, they will make their decisions based on the overall economics of the project and their view about the future of energy.
So in June, after this legislation was tabled, there were teams from 10 major oil and gas producers that were poring over the data, and that was tabulated for all these 37 parcels of land, and they were preparing their bids. Industry sources tell me that there were 10 companies preparing bids. When this legislation was tabled, the interest waned. Why are you trying to kill Newfoundland and Labrador's offshore oil and gas industry with the fear and the instability that this legislation is presenting to our producers?
Okay, I mean, that's just ridiculous. I mean, at the end of the day, companies make decisions. If you actually look at the prior years to 2023, and I'm not sure if you've looked at that, there were significant purchases of bids. At the end of the end of the day, this bill makes no significant.
Prior to your bill,
this bill makes no significant changes to the process with respect to oil and gas. And if you think it does, you should go back and read the bill.
So thank you, Minister Wilkinson, for your responses. We'll now go to Mr. Sorbrera for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome, Minister, to the Natural Resources Committee and the first day back in this session of Parliament. Minister, first off, if I could start on just a very more humble avenue, we are all elected MPs, and we are, one of the things I always say to my constituents is that I am your voice here in Ottawa. I bring your issues and concerns to Ottawa and fight for you every day. And I'm pretty certain that the folks back on the East Coast, including the premiers, are asking us to fight for them here in having Bill C-49 make its way through committee, be studied vigorously, and passed so we can use this as a catalyst to create wealth, to create jobs, and obviously transition to a net zero world, which here in Ontario we are seeing through the transition in the automotive sector, which our government is seized with today. And Minister, is this race, and I'm not going to say against time, but is this race that we are into to attract investment, that we need to slow down the consequences of climate change, seize the economic opportunities, and shift to a net zero environment, including our source of electricity, i.e. energy as well. And frankly, we cannot afford to lose, and we can't afford to waste time. And we know that the economic potential that this can bring us is significant, and it is bringing a lot of economic potential. And we're already blessed with 85% in Canada of our electricity generated from non-carbon sources. But I would like to hear from you, Minister, how this legislation, Bill C-49, will ensure Canada can continue to lead this race?
Well, thank you for the question. I mean, look, Canada faces a choice. We can either look to lead the global race to net zero, building on areas of comparative advantage or areas where we can reasonably develop comparative advantage in the world, or we can let it pass us by with all of the attendant consequences of being a late mover. We can lead, or we can bury our heads in the sand, which is what my Conservative colleagues clearly seem to want to do. In this context, development of clean energy grids, which this will enable, is really important. Development of long-term energy that can be exported around the world is really important, and this will enable that as well. It will create thousands of jobs, just like the battery plants and the electric vehicle facilities and the net zero petrochemical facility and the eMolly 1 battery facility in Maple Ridge, British Columbia. It will create enormous jobs. It will create economic prosperity for communities across both provinces. It is why both the Premier of Nova Scotia and the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador strongly support this bill that they helped to negotiate.
Thank you. 2 minutes? Thank you, Minister. The one thing that you've been doing over your time in this position and others is you obviously travel internationally and speak to investors wanting to invest in Canada, and specifically in various sectors of our economy, where we are leading the transition to non-carbon industry. We know that that's where the world is going. We know that under our leadership, that's where Canada is going. And I would want to ask, how are we uniquely positioned to continue attracting that investment? We see the numbers where the third most FDI flows for the first half of 23, and I look forward to seeing the full year results. I think we'll be up in those top levels. But like you said, the Dow investment in Alberta's industrial heartland, the investments in BC, Ontario, Quebec, really across the board. How are we positioned there, Minister?
Well, I think we're very well positioned. Canada has a relatively clean grid and the opportunity to actually build upon that, to have abundance, affordability, reliability, to be able to utilize that for the purpose of clean domestic manufacturing. We actually have resources that the world needs, including critical minerals. And we actually have regulatory structures that are stable, political structures that are stable, and that is something that's really important in a world that is very, very challenging right now. So countries are very interested in Canada. We obviously need to move. We need to be cost competitive. We need to enable things like Bill C-49 to ensure that we actually are putting in place the regulatory structure that will allow us to move forward. But Canada is enormously well situated. We just cannot bury our heads in the sand and pretend the energy transition is not happening, which is what the Conservative Party of Canada, for whatever reason, seems to want to do.
Thank you, Minister. Time's up. Thank you, Mr. Sparrow. We're now going to go to 5 minutes to Mr. Ellis. Mr. Ellis, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Chair. Thanks for being here, Minister. I think it was very disappointing to hear you start the climate change rhetoric and suggesting that the Conservatives, because we have questions, are climate change deniers. You know and I know that's just foolishness. This process is designed to have questions. And the sad part is you're the person here to answer them. So your beginning rhetoric is very disappointing for the person that I've come to know. And that being said, is your primary purpose here a climate crusade or is it an economic case? Because as we get into this, we know the economics doesn't exist. So which is it, climate crusade or economics?
Well, it is both. And I would say while I enjoy our conversations in the gym, I got to call it like it is. The Conservative Party of Canada's climate plan is to let the planet burn. You cannot take any other observation away from everything that you folks oppose, from having zero interest in actually reducing emissions. It is appalling that you folks have such disregard for the future of our children and our grandchildren. At the end of the day, though, you have to fight climate change. You have to do it in a manner that is economically workable. And we are doing both.
This is a Nova Scotia member of Parliament trying to ask questions about an Atlantic Canadian
Thank you, colleagues.
legislation that
I would just ask all colleagues to give the minister, if you ask a question, just give him enough time to answer the question. And so there's appropriate balance. Mr. Ellis, the floor is yours. Please continue.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I guess, Minister, I would suggest to you that I'm the one asking the questions. You're the one to provide the answers. And if I'm interrupting you, I think that that's a very reasonable thing. I'm trying to be respectful here, sir. You know, I would also suggest to you that your government's policies have driven 2 million Canadians to food banks every month. You're taxing them into oblivion. Now, if we want to talk about the business case here, what happened to the business case of tidal power?
Well, I'm not sure how much you know about tidal power, but certainly the
It's in
issue
my
that
writing,
they ran
Minister.
into with respect to DFO was an issue about trying to figure out a pathway through which you could actually protect fish and fish habitat. But tidal power is far from commercial at this stage. It's got to come down a significant amount of cost reduction before it would be deployed on a commercial basis. So I would suggest that perhaps happy to sit down with you and have a conversation about technology, but that's not one that's ready for prime time right now.
Minister, how many fish were struck in the sustainable marine environment that they had in the Minas Basin? How many fish?
So, I mean, there were projects that were projects that were permitted. There were projects that were permitted. But as I say, we've established a working group with DFO and with the province of Nova Scotia to ensure that we're actually addressing both of those issues. We want to see renewable energy move ahead. It has to be in a manner that's consistent with the protection of fish and fish habitat.
Chair, I suggest that you need to get control of this committee. I asked one simple question. How many fish were struck? How long was that question, Chair? 10 seconds? How long was the foolish answer? A minute and a half?
Chair.
And we still don't know the answer.
That's not a point of order, that's his time.
I didn't
running his
ask
time.
a point of order.
You count that as his time, correct?
The time has been running. Colleagues,
thank you.
I will stop the clock now. Colleagues, once again, if you ask a question, we want to give the minister time to answer the question. If you don't like his answer, that's your prerogative, but you ask a question. The minister's taken time to come today to answer your questions, so just give him enough time to answer the question. So I'll turn the floor back to you, Mr. Ellis.
Once again, Chair, very simple question. How many fish were struck by the Sustainable Marine Project in the Minas Basin?
I'm more than happy to ask the Department of Fisheries and Oceans for an answer to that question.
Thank you very much, Minister. Clearly you don't know. That being said, when we begin to look at the economics of the hydrogen case, which you so much you want to talk about, tell us a bit about green hydrogen and the cost to develop on a per kilogram basis. What's the cost? How many, let's say, euro per kilogram?
It totally depends on the scale. It depends on the wind speeds. It depends on a whole range of things. But look, I mean, you're from Nova Scotia. You're from Nova Scotia. There is a leading company there called Everwind that has developed a business case. They can certainly tell you what their estimate is for their cost of production. But I'm not going to give you their internal numbers. That's commercially confidential.
I would suggest, sir, that you have no idea that because you're not even calculating the capital cost, the creation cost, and the shipping cost for hydrogen, which you want to go on and talk about is such a great thing for our European partners. And we very clearly know that that is an insurmountable cost at the current time. Without your government pouring incredible...
Talk to the CEO of Everwind, who has spent $200 million of his own money developing the business case for this.
What kind of a committee is this? It's a great one. It's a poorly run one. That being said, now we have a chirping from somebody else who's doesn't even have the floor. That being said, what we know very clearly that there is no business case at the current time for shipping hydrogen in the state of ammonia. We know that. Everybody knows that around the world. But here you are saying that what we need to do here is have wind on the offshore, which could potentially interfere with many things, especially the fishery in Nova Scotia. And we don't even have a fully realized onshore wind industry in Nova Scotia. So here you are touting this business case, which your government is wont to do, telling us how great things are without any business case and without the ability to provide any numbers whatsoever as to the cost of creation of hydrogen, for example, which you want to be the crown jewel, I'll use that word.
Minister, I'll ask you for a brief comment.
How much experience you have in business, but typically the business case is developed by a company. There are companies, a number of companies in Newfoundland, Labrador, and in Nova Scotia. There are companies in Alberta and in Japan that are actually looking at the development of hydrogen and shipping it as ammonia. So, I mean, I'm more than happy to sit down and have a longer conversation about this with you, but your facts are just not fact.
Thank you, Minister. I will now go to Mr. Blois for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister, thank you for being here before the committee. It has been interesting to be back on the committee, and sorry to the translators, I would say, with the amount of interruption. But For Canadians that are sitting at home, Minister, including those in Atlantic Canada, because this is a piece of legislation that uniquely impacts Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Labrador, why is this legislation important? I heard some of our colleagues, including Mr. Simard, kind of ask, like, why are we doing this? The Atlantic Accords were really important to the shared governance of the Atlantic offshore for oil and gas. That remains the case. But why was this needed to help drive green hydrogen?
Well, at the present time, there is no regulatory structure for the development of offshore wind. So you cannot have projects proceeding at the present time without this bill actually being passed. And as I say, both Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia have identified the development of offshore wind and onshore wind as being critical for their future, their economic future. That is both in terms of providing electricity to the grid, but it is also about producing hydrogen that will be shipped to others around the world. And they see this, and I see this, as an opportunity to create thousands of jobs and prosperity.
I think you touched on the point that this is joint governance, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But obviously, the government took a deliberate choice to engage with the provinces, and I'm sure those conversations would have went back and forth with your colleagues at the provincial level to utilize the existing legislative framework for offshore oil and gas. Why was that decision taken? We heard colleagues sometimes talk, including the opposition, about not creating more bureaucracy or more redundancy. I see this as actually leveraging the strength of the existing Offshore Petroleum Board. Can you speak to explicitly why that vehicle that was already in place was just used and enhanced instead of creating a whole other regulatory agency?
So exactly for the reasons that you touch on there, the offshore boards have developed an enormous amount of expertise about how you do projects in the offshore and how you actually can permit projects in the offshore. Rather than starting from ground zero, where setting up a new agency would take years and even more years to actually develop the requisite competence in order to be able to do the job, we are leveraging the expertise that exists within the offshore boards, which will allow us to go much faster. And in a world that is moving, with countries around the world looking to seize the economic opportunities enabled through the transition that is happening to a low-carbon future, we needed to move.
One thing, as I sat here as an Atlantic Canadian MP and heard some of the concerns that were being levied, concerns would be, I would call it more rhetoric, but particularly where the Conservative Party is highlighting their opposition to this and resistance to the Government of Canada. What I think is being missed in this conversation is that this is not the Government of Canada imposing downwards on any province or territory. This is a partnership where this legislation was developed in concert with Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Labrador. You've mentioned it many times, but just quickly again, Minister, let's highlight the fact that this is a legislation that is being supported by legislatures in Newfoundland, Labrador, and in Nova Scotia, and that the governments therein are asking for this legislation to be expedited as soon as possible. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, we worked very hard. Our officials worked very hard to ensure that we were in agreement with respect to all of this. I spoke with both premiers on this legislation a number of different times. They are fully supportive of this, and in fact, as you say, they asked for this. They have actually both put out public statements in the last few months asking this committee and this Parliament to pass this bill. And that very much includes Premier Houston, the Conservative Premier of Nova Scotia.
And I think and you know what, there was actually a comment made, Minister, just off the microphone, progressive Conservative. I would agree with that comment that was made by my colleague here, because there is a difference, and Nova Scotians at home do see the difference between the stance and the positioning of the federal Conservatives versus the progressive Conservatives back home in Nova Scotia. Just quickly, Mr. Perkins talked about the fisheries industry. That is an extremely important sector. I would agree with him wholeheartedly. But what I didn't hear him talking about was the work of the Impact Assessment Agency on the regional review, engaging with fishing groups and engaging to identify areas of the ability to coexist, both with these types of technologies we're talking about, but also maintaining that really important fishery. Can you reassure this committee that that work is happening?
It is absolutely happening. I mean, the fishing community is extremely important. It's important economically. It's important for a whole range of reasons. I was Minister of Fisheries for almost 2 years, and I certainly understand and have met with many of the fishing organizations in both provinces and elsewhere in this country. We need to ensure that the voices of fish harvesters are heard. We have been consulting in the context of the work that's been done here, but certainly the regional assessment of offshore wind will include the voices of fish harvesters, and any individual project assessment will also hear the voices of fish harvesters. But I will also tell you, like, look around the world. I mean, there are many places, including the United Kingdom, where offshore wind fully and well coexists with the fishing industry. You just have to be smart and thoughtful about how you do it.
Thank you, Minister. We'll now go to Monsieur Simard for 2.5 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you so much. Let's go somewhere different. I'm going to draw you out here. There may be a connection, though, to what we're examining here today. I know that the tax credits for clean hydrogen, I think in 2023 and 24, it's the electricity ones that are coming into effect, so that would affect hydrogen. So I'm wondering, because I know this may apply to Newfoundland as well, we have a large company in Quebec, Rio Tinto, which might eventually want to create wind power and to better create hydrogen for their own site use, which means they would get a tax credit for the part of the development that would be a wind farm and the part that would be hydrogen development. Is that correct? That's possible. I would need to understand the project in greater detail, but the ITC right now, the way it works, will be filling in all the details about the investment tax credit, and I believe that the Minister of Finance will be announcing the details in the months to come. But of course, it's very likely, as you say. All right, so within the framework of C49, let's say you have a promoter who is creating a wind farm and also creating green hydrogen would receive both ITCs. That's your understanding so far? All right. So I have the impression, based on that offshore wind farms are mostly set up to create hydrogen. I'm giving you this example of a project in Quebec because for us, if you can't use Hydro-Quebec's infrastructure, it costs a great deal of money because what really costs a lot is all the grid work to get the electricity. So what's of interest to any producer is to access the infrastructure, Hydro-Quebec infrastructure in our case, if they want to be able to create something and sell it. I understand that in the framework we're looking at here with this bill, infrastructure isn't necessarily what these provinces will be making. They want to create offshore wind farms in order to produce hydrogen because they don't have the infrastructure that we have, for example. Is this a correct understanding of the situation? Of course, the Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador governments will be making these decisions, but they will probably use part of the electricity for their own grid and another part to produce hydrogen. However, if they wish to use the electricity for their own grid, they will need to invest in the infrastructure to be able to do so, as Quebec does.
We'll now go to Mr. Angus for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Minister. I want to reiterate my concern about delay. We know now that the Conservatives are going to oppose this bill that Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia want to move ahead with. My concern is, again, whether or not we're going to be in the game at all, given the massive investments in Europe, massive investments in China, massive investments in the United States. Our ability to compete is being put on the line. And I ask that in terms of the issue of hydrogen, which I know the Conservatives don't believe there's any economic case. I was in Germany meeting with Chancellor Scholz. I met with the head of the Chancellery, Wolfgang Schmidt. We met with senior officials. And they were asking really tough questions. Can Canada produce hydrogen? Can you meet our market demands? Because they're an enormous market in Germany. It's an industrial powerhouse. So is it possible for us to actually meet the German opportunity, or are we going to sit by this side of the road and let China or the United States take that?
Yes, but we need to get going. I mean, there are other countries like Qatar that are moving very rapidly to develop the production of hydrogen, particularly there from solar energy. So we need to actually move forward in a manner that actually can meet the timelines as well as the cost expectations of the Germans. I think that there is an enormous opportunity. I will be seeing Vice Chancellor Habeck in the next couple of months and having this conversation. But yes, there is an enormous opportunity. Similarly, in Alberta, there's an enormous opportunity to be able to produce hydrogen as ammonia and actually ship it to Japan. But there's an enormous amount of work that has to be done. We need to get going.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the potential in Alberta to do a clean energy economy is so evident, yet we have a premier who invites Russian propaganda troll people like Tucker Carlson, and she spent the whole winter trashing the clean energy projects that are already on the ground in Alberta. My concern is what it's doing is shifting certainty away from Canada and shifting investment away from Canada. So how can we move to get these projects on the ground and tell our friends in Europe we are going to compete?
Well, first and foremost, we need to get this project through Parliament and implemented. We need to get the investment tax credits finished, and they will be in the short term. We need to actually get to the point where we have a Conservative Party that believes in climate change and has a plan to address it, and an economy that will actually thrive in a low-carbon universe. The lack of certainty from a political perspective is impeding investment, and that's the fault of the Conservative Party of Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Angus, and thank you, Minister, for that. We'll now go to Ms. Stubbs for 5 minutes.
Minister, I would suggest that uncertainty is being caused by a government that has not moved in 108 days to fix a piece of legislation that you yourself claim is the cornerstone of your environmental and regulatory policies. The Supreme Court said in large part was unconstitutional. And speaking of those unconstitutional sections, of course, it's Section 64 of C69, that is in C49. That is in C4. I'm sure you've read C49, which is what we're talking about, so you can
said
catch up.
69, so.
Which allows the minister to interfere in a project, and this is what my colleague Rick Perkins was getting at earlier, if they think it's in the public interest. There's no definition of that. And then any conditions can be created that are deemed necessary. And that is exactly what has caused uncertainty in the Canadian energy sector, driven away billions of dollars of projects and private sector proponents. And it's interesting to hear your counterpart in your government, your NDP colleague there, worrying about missing the window, when of course the example, well, now we know why he doesn't worry, but of course an example of your destruction is LNG. 18 proposals when you came to office, only 3 approved, only 1 under construction is the one that was previously approved by the Harper government. Or the fact you keep talking about China with the same admiration that your Prime Minister once confessed to, and that Canada doesn't produce any lithium for Canadian use. It actually goes to China, and we can't get critical minerals or rare earth metals out of the ground in less than 25 years in this country because of your legislation. But I'd like to ask you some more questions. Why are there no costs in this bill? Surely to expand the mandate, the roles, the responsibilities, and the critical function of the regulator to assess risks to ecology, to marine wildlife, to habitat. These are related to offshore wind technology, which is new rather than petroleum development in the past. That you can assure that there are no costs involved in ensuring the boards have the resources, the skill set sufficient to execute their new mandates outlined in this bill?
I'm not even sure where to begin in terms of that monologue, but
Why
there were a
aren't there
whole
costs in
bunch
the bill?
of things that were just wrong in there,
bill?
including the fact that there is an operating lithium mine that came on stream in Quebec that actually produces for North America, and there's another one that's actually being developed. So there's a whole range of things you said that are just factually inaccurate.
No, the production on that mine isn't for Canadian use. It gets exported to China.
No, Soyona is in Quebec. Soyona is in Quebec, and it's used in North America. It's actually, yeah. So
used in North America, not in Canada. You got it.
So but what I would say is C-49 does not change the Impact Assessment Act. So I'm not sure where you're going with a lot of the things that you're actually saying.
I quoted you the section of C-69 that's in C-49. I quoted the section of C-49 that brings in that unconstitutional section from C-69, Minister.
Okay. So at the end of the day, in virtually all impact assessments, including CIA 2012, which was actually operationalized under the government of Stephen Harper, which I would suggest was a conservative
talking-
government,
Okay, but you've
there
been
are
in government
decisions at the
for
end of
9
it which are
years.
made by democratically elected authorities.
Minister Wilkinson, can you hold for a sec? We have a point of order from Mr. Bruson.
It's just, again, it's really hard to follow when every time Ms. Stubbs is speaking over the minister. So I'm just asking, just to find a sequence to it that we're not speaking at the same time. It's
So
making it really hard.
thank you, Mr. Bruson, for that reminder. I think the nice sequence is we ask a question, we get an answer, and we let the individual asking the question finish, and then the individual, in this case the minister, answer the question before we move to the next one. It also is very helpful for our interpreters who are trying to interpret the back and forth. So one at a time, let's not speak over each other, and I think we'll have a smooth remainder of the meeting. Minister Wilkinson, sorry to interrupt you partway through your response, but I'll turn it back to you to respond.
I was just saying it is normal in a democratic system that democratic authorities actually have the final decision-making authority. That was true under SIA 2012, which Stephen Harper actually put into place. So I'm not
My
sure
question
exactly where
was
she's going
cost
with
and
that.
resourcing to the boards to execute their new
So
mandates.
the resourcing to the boards, it works in the same way that other regulatory authorities work, which is that they are cost recovered from industry. They're not paid for by the government.
So all of the execution of the new mandates imposed on the regulators by the government, you're going to get that completely from industry.
Yeah, that is the intent, in the same way that it is for the offshore petroleum, and that's the same thing for the Canada Energy Regulator.
Yeah, interesting, except that my Atlantic Canadian colleagues have just explained with proof here to you that there's no such development, and that the signal that the private sector proponent took from this bill was to bail out.
Well, I will tell you that all the work that they do with respect to bids and everything else, existing facilities, the approval of the Bay du Nord project a couple of years ago, that's all cost recovered from industry.
Pardon? Oh, good. Oh, sorry. So, Minister, in C-49, you have the same ability to end any current development by issuing in the anti-development zones. As you know, and as we've discussed frequently, Indigenous people communities are involved at extremely high levels in the energy sector and all kinds of sources of energy. In fact, energy companies are the biggest employers of Indigenous people across Canada. That's why things like the just transition will hurt them disproportionately. In your bill, like in others, you have no requirement for consultation when you cancel licenses, when, as a result of invoking an anti-development zone, which you give the power to do here in C-49, there's no requirement for consultation with either of those private sector proponents, but importantly, either with Indigenous communities or people who may be involved in both offshore petroleum and alternative development as equity owners and private sector proponents.
So if one was to cancel a holding for reasons of biodiversity protection or something, it can only be done in conjunction with the province. And of course, in those kinds of circumstances, you would arrive at that conclusion only after actually having consultations with a range of folks.
Thank you.
The Prime Minister didn't
Thank
do that
you,
consultation when he
Ms.
canceled
Stubbs,
Northern
and thank you,
Gateway.
Minister Wilkinson, for your answer. Time is up. We're now going to go to Ms. Jones for the next round.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to remind people, because there's a lot of discussion that is very much fragmented and not directly related to the bill, but the primary beneficiaries of the Atlantic Accord has been the provinces in which oil and gas have been developed. And it has allowed them to have royalties and benefits from the industry that would not have been afforded to them without the Atlantic Accord in the first place. The last government that tried to shut down the Atlantic Accord was the Stephen Harper government. And it was in 2006. And I remember it well. I sat in the Newfoundland and Labrador legislature when Premier Danny Williams had to go fighting day in and day out with the federal government and with Stephen Harper and the Conservatives to land the Atlantic Accord again in Newfoundland and Labrador. So I say to my colleague, the only one hoodwinking people here today is the Conservatives by trying to find reasons to line up against the Accord so that Newfoundlanders and Labradorians and Nova Scotians don't get the benefits of these jobs, of these opportunities that they normally have been used to and are owed. The bill that's here before us is here because these provinces have proven in Canada, you can make all the fun you want over there, I really don't care. You can laugh out loud, you can do whatever you want. But let me tell you this, These provinces have led the offshore oil and gas industry in this country. Today, they're asking to lead the offshore wind industry in this country. They have the expertise and the resources to make it happen. I'm actually so disappointed to sit here today with Atlantic MPs that are not supportive of what their provinces are doing when they have a proven record in jobs and opportunities. I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, I've heard so much today that is unsubstantial, incorrect, and unnecessary at this table in dealing with this bill. But I want to say to you, Minister, I want to go back because I know the bill is here because these provinces want to be leaders in the clean energy of Canada. They want to be leaders in the world in offshore wind. And I want to give them every opportunity to do that. And I want to get back to the real crust of what we're dealing with here. And that is sustaining economies in this country and leading the world in green energy. Can you tell us in C49, without the rhetoric, without the interruptions, how this is benefiting not just these provinces in Atlantic Canada, but the real difference is going to make to us as a country as well to move forward with this? And I ask you that, Minister, in all sincerity, because I've heard so much today that is so unnecessary at this table in dealing with a bill that is fundamentally important to the livelihoods of people in Newfoundland and Labrador and in Nova Scotia.
Well, thank you for the question. We set up a couple of years ago something called the Regional Energy and Resource Tables, which were really to work individually with every province and territory to identify those key areas of economic opportunity and to build on those in a collaborative way with investments, with training, with a whole range of things to be able to actually accelerate development. Certainly in the context of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador, their number one priority for both of them was working on onshore and offshore wind development, both for the purposes of creating a broader and more abundant electricity system, but also to produce hydrogen. They saw that there was an opportunity to be able to create thousands and thousands of jobs, an enormous add to their gross domestic product, by actually working collaboratively with us. And this bill is the product of those efforts. It will be a driver of prosperity for people who live in both of those provinces going forward. That is why Premier Fury and Premier Houston are strongly encouraging every member of this committee to move expeditiously to pass this bill.
Minister, I want to raise another issue as well. It has been said here today that this bill will allow Canada to arbitrarily make decisions over the oil and gas industry, over offshore wind, whatever the case may be in Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia. Nothing in this bill, Minister, can you tell us if there's anything in this bill that really allows Canada to do that without consulting with the provinces that are binding partners in C49 and without going through that particular legislative process to make the changes, the consultation and legislative process that are necessary?
So the Accord Acts were developed jointly, and they require joint support. They are meant to be jointly governing this area, the offshore area. That was a commitment that was made legally between Canada and Newfoundland and Labrador, Canada and Nova Scotia. In order to actually change the obligations that one or other party has or the way in which things are done, it requires the agreement on the part of the province and the federal government.
Thank you, Ms. Jones. Thank you, Minister. We will now go to Mr. Perkins. Mr. Perkins, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I was going to ask the Minister when he'll bring forward the ITCs and CCUS, and he keeps promising it if they'll do it offshore and C49.
Point of order. Who has the floor?
He was finishing,
we have a point of order.
chewing, and I'm sure that he can tell me to zip it himself, guys.
Okay,
That should
colleagues,
come out of Mr. Perkins' time.
we have a point of order. Mr. Perkins does have the floor, so Mr. Perkins, we'll go to you with the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister, I was interested that you brought up Everwind. We had Everwind before the Finance Committee in the pre-budget consultations, and I asked the president of Everwind, I said, have you developed any science with regard to the impact of both the offshore windmill locations and the transmission cables on the ocean floor, where they want to put them in the eastern shore off of Guysborough. And he said, no, none, no science. He also said that when I asked him if he had consulted with any fishing groups in the discussion of their project, he said no. Do you believe that's an appropriate way for these organizations to operate, to propose a policy that has absolutely no science conducted in the area that they want to do on what it will do to marine species, and that they don't talk to the local stakeholders who earn a living from the sea there?
So maybe I can just explain how this works. There's a regional environmental assessment that actually is going on that will identify areas that are suitable for this kind of development and areas that are not suitable for this kind of development. Once that is done, it actually enables companies to look at some of those areas to determine if, in fact, they are interested in applying for the rights. In that context, the science is being done through the regional environmental assessment, and it will be done through any project-specific assessment that the company actually puts forward. And of course, the company will also be doing its own science once it actually knows where it wants to put it. But we're not at that stage yet.
I don't believe that the company has any obligation to do any of that work now before they even start proposing it. His answer to me,
until
just
you've
a moment,
actually
don't
identified
interrupt
the
me,
areas
please,
that are
Minister,
suitable.
don't interrupt me.
Well, you asked a question.
Don't interrupt me.
You asked a question.
I'm in the middle of my
Order.
question. You can't interrupt me in the middle of my
Mr.
question.
Perkins, I'll ask you to hold. Minister, if you could please hold. Colleagues, I understand question and an answer. So as we start a question, we finish a question. Let's get a complete answer. You can come back to your next question. We don't need multiple people speaking in the mics at the same time. So one at a time. Now we'll have the floor. Well, you asked the minister a question. And
I wasn't finished.
Okay, so
and it's not for him to presume when I'm finished.
Proceed with your question.
Minister, so you think it's appropriate for a company that wants to locate, that's owned by foreign owners, to come to Nova Scotia and not talk to the local groups and not have any science? His response to my question was, there's lots of science in Scotland. We don't need to do any science.
Well, I wasn't there when he was there, and I wouldn't agree with him. If that was what he said, I wouldn't agree with that. There is science that is required. It is being developed under the regional assessment. It will be developed under a project-specific assessment. But companies, until they actually know where they are actually looking to locate, which will be the product of the regional assessment, I'm not sure what science they're going to be able to do because they're not even sure where the location is. So, yes, eventually they will need to do that. But we're not at that stage yet. We're doing the regional assessment work, which is the first step.
They know where they want to put it, so I would see that they could start that. But let's talk about the business case. You mentioned the business case, and you've been very condescending to some of my colleagues about it. I've had an extensive business background. I know you have. But you understand that if I say I'm going to invest $1 in something and the government said, that's great, I'm going to give you $1.15 back in taxpayer money for every dollar you put in, that's not a very risky situation, which is what's happening with your government. The accelerated capital cost allowance for these projects right now is 75%. And in your budget, in the fall economic statement, you put in for, in the case of green hydrogen, another 40% input tax credit. That's 115% credit that they can get for spending $1. Now, do you think without that taxpayer subsidy that is not only subsidizing all the costs but giving them a profit on the taxpayer, without that any money and capital would be coming here to do this, since it doesn't have a business case that says that it will produce wind energy at a comparable cost to the energy that we already have in our province?
So the investment tax credits don't apply just to hydrogen. They also apply to carbon capture and sequestration and a range of other things, including electricity generation. They are intended to allow us to move forward expeditiously, particularly with new technologies and technologies that are still coming down the cost curve, where it is important to actually put in place measures to stimulate that. That is not different from what governments around the world are doing. And you can have a look at what governments are doing with respect to this kind of stuff everywhere. At the end of the day, Canada intends to be a long-term player in this game, and Nova Scotia and Newfoundland intend to be a long-term players in this game.
I don't believe the projects can exist without the fact that the government is essentially nationalizing and paying for it all through the taxpayer when you've got 115% that they can get back on $1 that they invest.
So the investment tax credit pays a portion of the capital, only a portion of the capital for a period of time. They expire at a certain period of time as we've actually got to the point where the market is more mature. We can choose to actually not pursue these opportunities and let the jobs go elsewhere and the economic prosperity. And if that's what you're suggesting, that's certainly something that you can do. But I would tell you that is not the view of every other G7 country in the world. That is not the view of the Premier of Nova Scotia. That is not the view of the Premier of Newfoundland. We believe in seizing the economic opportunities that are going to drive the economic future of Canada.
Thank you, Minister. And we'll now go to Mr. Blois for 5 minutes. Go ahead, Mr. Blois.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Minister, I'll take you back to before Christmas. I don't remember exactly the date that C-49 was introduced, but as a Nova Scotia member of Parliament, I assumed that this was going to be a relatively straightforward process. It is a legislative change that actually enables an existing regulatory agency on offshore oil and gas to be extended the same privileges to regulate the activities of offshore wind, which play into hydrogen and play into the decarbonization. Call it a gift, call it whatever you want. I was shocked to see the Conservative Party oppose this. And I do see it, look, this place is to have legitimate conversation about the angles and the issues of the bill, but I haven't heard it. You've been here for almost 2 hours, and I have yet to hear a substantive piece about what is a problem. Now, Ms. Stubbs is yelling across the way about the Impact Assessment Act. And I'm glad, Minister, honestly, that you have said that there will be updates coming in short order. But that is fundamentally different than what we're talking about here. Because what we're talking about here is an actual where the provinces are acquiescing. And as I hear Ms. Stubbs yelling.
Point of order. I'm not yelling. I'll just say it into the mic. Cody, just for clarity, I actually cited the sections in C-49 that include the unconstitutional sections from C-69. Just for clarity. Thanks, Chair.
We have a point of order, colleagues. I just want to make sure we use point of orders for a point of order, not for a point of clarification or a point of debate. So let's please refrain from using it as a way to debate or interrupt another member. Did you have a point of order as well, Mr. Angus?
Yes, Chair. I have enormous respect for you, but I'm here to get work done. I'm here to hear from the minister. I'm not here to deal with interference. I'm here to hear what Mr. Blois has to say. He's a legitimate member. We need to stop this pattern of trying to throw people off and just throw mud.
Thank you for that. Mr. Blois, I'm going to turn the floor back to you. Apologies for the interruption. Go ahead.
So, Mr. Chair, what I was trying to say is there is a differentiation between the concerns that are being raised by the Conservative Party in relation to one piece of federal legislation, which the Minister said we'll have an update on shortly, versus what we're talking about here. Because this is something that the province of Nova Scotia and the government of Newfoundland and Labrador have jointly said we want these provisions in. And so when I hear the Conservative Party here today say that they know better than the province where I live and the governments that are therein that have been duly elected in both Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia, it reeks of condensation that party, the federal party, knows better than the provinces. Now, Ms. Stubbs has rightfully said, look, the provinces were out saying that they support it. Well, I haven't heard any single premier step up and say that they don't want to see this legislation advance, even after the court decision. So I see these as two fundamentally different things. I see it as an attack on Atlantic Canada. I only have so much time, Minister, but just any quick comment that you might have in terms of how you see those two things as being different, particularly where there's provincial buy-in.
Well, I think you've pointed it out. I mean, they are very different, and the relationship with them is reasonably well understood. But I would say that while there has been some controversy with respect to the Impact Assessment Act, and there have been some provinces that have objected to some of the provisions in the Impact Assessment Act, there is nobody that is impacted by this bill at the provincial level that is opposing this. They are all strongly supporting it, and in fact, they actually helped to negotiate it. So I, like you, was gobsmacked that the Conservative Party would actually oppose this bill. It makes no reasonable sense in any reasonable world.
I have a comment, and then I have a quick question, Minister. There's been a lot made that somehow this is, I don't want to frame it in their words, but a backdoor against the idea of development of oil and gas. I don't see it that way at all. You've made very clear that's not the intent of this legislation. In fact, I want the record to show that in terms of exploratory wells during the Atlantic Offshore Accord, in terms of permitting, before the Harper government came into place, 300 days. During the Harper government's tenure, it went up to 900 days. Our government brought it back down to 90 days. This is oil and gas. This is the thing that the Conservatives want to talk about a lot. It is important to the region, I would agree. But there's a slogan a lot, Minister, around technology, not taxes. We hear the member from Carleton talking about this. We hear this trumpeted from the opposition benches. Is this not technology, not taxes? That we are talking about leveraging an existing technology that is emerging to actually help us decarbonize and to export around the world. And the Conservatives are still against the enabling legislation that actually allows that to happen. Do you not see that as a bit hypocritical? Because, look, they can take issues with carbon pricing and whatever the case may be, but this isn't carbon pricing. This is the technology and industry to drive us, and they're still against it. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole tagline of technology, not taxes, is a tagline. It's not a strategy. It's not a well-thought-out sort of way of thinking about this. Technology actually requires that you think about how you develop technology, you think about how you demonstrate technology, and ultimately you think about how you commercially deploy technology, including incentives to actually deploy early-stage technologies going forward. It requires thought. Like CCUS, you are not simply deploying because it's a revenue generator. You're actually deploying it because you're actually trying to save the planet. And Mr. Poilievre trying to use technology, not taxes, as somehow a strategy is a bit laughable. I mean, this is a guy who got elected out of university. He's never worked on technology. He's never worked in business. He sat in a green chair for 20 years and now is, entitled to whatever pension that he's going to entitle to. But he has zero background in the relevant parts of this business.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. Colleagues, once again, the question was asked, the minister answered, and other mics turned on. I'm asking everybody, when this mic comes on is when I speak, and if you're acknowledged, you have the floor, and if you're asked a question, like the minister is answering up today, he gets the floor. So let's try to maintain that order so we can have a good functioning remainder of this committee. With that, Monsieur Simard, the floor is yours for 2.5 minutes.
Oui, bon, faisons tous preuve.
Yes, thank you. So let's all stay calm and use common sense. That will help us move forward effectively. I was saying earlier, Honourable Minister, that I had some doubts about what you intend with this bill. Let me explain. When I look at the ITCs that already exist for carbon capture and storage, those coming in 2023 for green hydrogen and 2024 for clean electricity, I was asking you, whether Newfoundland, Labrador is already able to create offshore wind farms, and you said, yes, we've got to adopt this bill first. However, in Newfoundland's plan in 2023, that's when they came out with it, they are already speaking of 5 gigawatts to be created before 2025. So producing 5 gigawatts, that will take a lot of money, won't it? So if the federal government supports private projects, that will cost a lot. If we want then to turn those 5 gigawatts of electrical energy into hydrogen, that's going to take some time and some money. Is there not a contradiction here? On one side, you're offering money for clean petrol, if I can put it that way, the carbon capture and storage projects. And then here you have this other set of projects, 5 gigawatts. That's quite a large volume of electricity. It doesn't look like it's all going to balance out. The investments that you're going to be able to make in petroleum, oil and gas projects, and investments that are needed in green energy. Wouldn't it be smarter to simply drop the entire project for carbon capture and sequestration?
We devons faire deux choses.
We need to do two things. We need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions across the entire economy in all sectors, and that includes, of course, the oil and gas sector. And we also need to fight climate change. We do, though, need a plan for a prosperous future. And the plan will be different in each province and territory. In Nova Scotia, in Newfoundland and Labrador, wind energy, hydrogen energy is part of the plan. In the budget, we have laid out investments of around $85 million. That's a lot of money, yes, but it's important to do so.
We're at the end of time with that. Thank you, Minister and Mr. Smart. Very good questions. Now I'll go to Mr. Angus for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, I've been, the issue of climate catastrophe that's unfolding and calling out climate denialism is very important. But, I look at my family. My mom's a McNeil. Everyone in her village in Cape Breton left. They went to Ontario, they went to Boston, they went out west because there was no permanent good employment. In my region, whenever there's a new mining project, the planes are full from Newfoundland, and they come and work because there's not enough work at home. So we're talking about the potential of creating jobs in construction and permanent jobs in Newfoundland, Labrador, Nova Scotia. I think that's above and beyond partisan bickering. It should be. We're looking at 471,000 solar and wind jobs in the United States, and we have the Conservatives sitting here saying that the Premier of Newfoundland got hoodwinked, that they're saying there's no business case, they're saying they're going to oppose it. I am really concerned, Minister, if we keep waiting, we will lose this opportunity because that investment is traveling and it's happening. It's not hypothetical. It's on the ground all over the world, but here. How do we get these projects off the ground in conjunction working with the people of Labrador, Newfoundland, and Nova Scotia?
Well, it is important that we do this and that we do this expeditiously. None of the work, none of the projects happen unless we actually have a regulatory system in place. I, like you, thought this was one of those areas where there would be no objection and we would all come together and just support this bill. I was very surprised when the Conservative decided that they would oppose this. But at the end of the day, we need to ensure that the committee has robust discussion, that it actually invites experts to actually have this, but we need to then move it along. If we are going to actually achieve the economic development that we want to see in these provinces, if we want to actually ensure that we are able to work with our allies around the world on the future economy, we need to see this happen.
Thank you. You got a few extra seconds, but you're turning it back to me, so thank you,
Absolutely.
Mr. Angus. We'll now go to Mr. Small. Go ahead, Mr. Small.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And the member for Labrador accused me of not supporting my province. While the production of oil, Mr. Chair, while the production of oil in Newfoundland and Labrador has dropped by half since the Liberal NDP coalition came to power. So why do you want to shut down? Don't be having that look on your face down there. Why do you want to shut down an industry that provides 30% of the GDP of Newfoundland and Labrador? Why do you want to destroy that? And what's your timeline?
I have no intention of destroying anything. I mean, at the end of the day, I work very closely with Premier Furey and his government. We have done all kinds of work across a range of files, including the oil and gas file. I certainly was involved very much in the conversations around Bay du Nord. So, I mean, that kind of an implication is just silly.
So, and then I heard the member, my friend from King's Hants, making fun of technology, not taxes. Well, you know what? Technology, not taxes, right? So natural gas is proven to produce half the greenhouse gases that coal produces. Last year, India and China set a record for coal consumption, and it's going up again. So if using natural gas is not technology instead of taxes...
Point of order?
We have a point of order from Mr. Angus. Mr. Angus, go ahead.
Well, the Conservatives interrupted me and said that I was talking about what wasn't involved. Is natural gas, are we looking at natural gas as part of this agreement? Is that something that's happening offshore in Newfoundland?
Thank you, Mr. Angus, for your point of order. I just want to make sure, colleagues, we don't use point of order for debate, but colleagues, we use our time to stay relevant to the topic at hand. So, Mr. Small, I would go back to you, and you can continue on with your line of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll give you a little education here that natural gas is one of the petroleum products that this bill is going to have power over and the development of it. So, Mr. Angus, and this point of order is a pile of baloney there. So why would you want to bring in legislation that's stopping the development of the 9 trillion cubic feet of natural gas on the Grand Banks which would go to help and drop the greenhouse gas emissions of the world by 25%. And that's guaranteed if all coal was stopped being burned and we use natural gas instead. Guaranteed drop in world emissions of 25%. Why are you against that?
Well, first of all, that's not guaranteed. You have to actually look at the methane emissions associated with the upstream. You have to look at the emissions associated with how you liquefy the LNG before you actually ship it. So your case of half relates to Canada versus Japan, but only in the circumstance where you're actually doing things to fight climate change, which your party opposes. But at the end of the day, natural gas can be part of a transition. That is why LNG Canada 2 is being built. That is why wood fiber is being built. And certainly, companies are free to bring forward, based on their assessment of the future market, projects to go through the assessment process.
Thank you. And it's great to hear you acknowledge that that natural gas can be a part of the solution. So if it's a part of the solution, and now you've come to this new reasoning and a new thought process, why did you not approve all of those LNG plants? It's just 2. There were like over 15 on the books when you came to power. So knowing what you knew, what you're saying now, you know it now. Why did it take so long to come to that to that knowledge?
Well, first of all, there's 3. And second of all, the government didn't actually turn down any of those projects if you go back and actually look at that. So at the end of the day, the question for companies that actually are proposing LNG facilities going forward is, what is the market going to look like going forward? And what the International Energy Agency says is that demand globally for oil and for gas will peak in this decade. So you've got to take that into account in terms of whether you're going to actually have stranded assets and whether you're going to be able to pay back your capital. That's up for companies to decide.
And you mentioned the cost to liquefy natural gas. What's the cost to liquefy hydrogen?
Not the cost to liquefy, it's the nature of how you liquefy. So you can either use natural gas to liquefy or you can use electricity to liquefy. But if you use natural gas, the emissions are much higher, and therefore you're not actually gaining a lot when you're displacing coal.
How much more time is left, Mr. Chair?
30 seconds.
Oh, my God. Thank you very much. That's wonderful. So going back, right out of the gate, Minister, you talked about your consultations with stakeholders. So when did you consult with the FFAW, which is the largest fishing industry stakeholder group in Canada? On what date was it?
I will ask my officials in terms of the date, but there were 2 collective organizations, one of which the FFAW is part of, that were part of the conversation.
Well, I can tell you did not consult with them because I asked them if you did. You did not consult with them.
Well, I'm happy to take that away, and I'm happy to take that away and look at what the dates were. But I'm pretty sure the department actually did.
What about
thank you, Mr. Small? Thank you. The time is up. Thank you, Minister Wilkinson, for your response. We'll now go to Mr. Cervera. Mr. Cervera, go ahead.
Order?
Yes.
I thought the meeting was till 5:30.
Thank you, Mr. Angus. We did start a few minutes late, and so we'll just finish this round, and we'll...
So is that the end of the round?
Mr. Sorbera would be the end of the round.
Okay, I would normally say that we need unanimous consent, but since I like Mr. Sorbera, on most days, I will not cause any more trouble.
Yeah, sorry, colleagues, we did start a few minutes late, so we'll go to Mr. Sorbera. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am going to split my time with my colleague and friend from Nova Scotia, MP Blois. Minister, I'm going to ask the question in French just to change it up a little bit on Bill C-49 and the implications of Bill C-49 with regards to our race to a net zero economy and obviously benefiting our environment. Ministre, quelles sont les conséquences?
Honourable Ministers, what are the effects of this legislation of delaying its adoption on our place in the race for net carbon zero future? Well, globally, around the world, all countries are doing everything they can to move on economic opportunity. And if Canada wishes to fall back and behind the others, sure, that's an option. But that will be horrific for our future economy. We need to move on this. We need to take action. And that's what we're doing.
So, Minister, I guess I'll take over from here. Just a quick question. We've talked a lot about how this bill enables the development of offshore wind for export of green hydrogen or ammonia. It would be the transportation. But we have still a lot of our electricity in Nova Scotia, which is generated by coal. My understanding is the potential in offshore wind would far exceed the electricity demand on our province. Can you speak just very quickly to not only how this could have export opportunities for green hydrogen, but could help Nova Scotia and indeed help meet the demands in central Canada, like in Quebec or other provinces, particularly if we upgrade our transmission, which I know is an ongoing conversation right now?
Yeah, I mean, look, there is a need to decarbonize the Nova Scotia grid. We are working very closely with Nova Scotia. I have worked very closely with Premier Houston on this, and we are supporting the development of a whole range of things that are going to help them to actually get off coal and ultimately to decarbonize the grid. Certainly onshore and offshore wind are part of that, but I would say, like a 1 gigawatt facility offshore would produce enough electricity for a third of the households in Nova Scotia. So if you're looking at building out 15, 20 gigawatts over time, it's much more than you actually will need domestically, and that creates opportunities for hydrogen, but it also potentially creates opportunities about helping New Brunswick with its phase out, or actually transmitting it through new transmission facilities to Quebec, which can use it in the context of intermittent power. They can balance it because they have the big hydro battery, and that can enable further exports to Ontario or to the United States. So it is an enormous economic opportunity.
And just very quickly, Mr. Angus talked about this. Look, I'm one of the younger parliamentarians here in the country. My generation, coming out of university, there was a huge exodus of people my age that were going to Western Canada. Nova Scotia and Atlantic Canada has certainly held its own in the economic sense in the Federation. There's been a lot of good jobs. And Mr. Angus asked you a question that I want to get on the record so I can tell my constituents at home about how this is about creating good jobs. It's not just about the environment. Obviously, there's huge environmental impacts from reducing our GHG emissions and being able to move towards a low carbon economy. But this is really about good jobs at the end of the day, well-paying jobs in rural parts of Atlantic Canada, which I think is extremely important. Can you just quickly allude to that? And if I have any extra time, I'm going to go to my colleague from Labrador.
Yeah, I mean, this is the fantastic thing about many of the opportunities that are going to be enabled through this transition is that they are going to create good jobs in rural and remote areas, like critical minerals in Mr. Angus's riding. But it's hydrogen in many of the rural communities in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador. So, yes, that's a huge benefit. And it's part of creating an economy that is going to actually be a thriving economy in a world that is fundamentally going to look different. If we believe in the science of climate change, things need to change in terms of how we actually do things. This is a part of a strategy to ensure Canada is actually a leader from an economic perspective moving forward.
Thank you. I just want to pick up on the issue with regard to the FFAW and the fisheries sector in Newfoundland and Labrador. I've never known in my time in politics, in all of the amendments and changes that we've made to the Atlantic Accord bill, that there has been opposition by the FFAW. But certainly if it is, I'd ask my colleague to table it at committee so that we can review it. Obviously, we are huge supporters of the fishing industry in Canada. I'm a former Minister of Fisheries myself in Newfoundland and Labrador, and I want to ensure that the fishery sector
Point of order,
has
Mr.
been
Chair.
consulted and is a big part of what's happening here. But
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead.
For the
Point of
record,
order.
I did not say that the FFAW did not support wind energy or this bill in any way. I tell you what, I consulted with them, and they told me that they didn't get a phone call while this bill was being formulated.
Thank you, Mr. Small, for your point of order that went into debate. Just to conclude, as time is up, to conclude, Ms. Jones, and floor is back to yours.
thank you, and I'm really glad my colleague clarified that, because in my time I've not been aware of it, but I certainly want to make sure for the record, Minister, that it's understood that we are very supportive of the fishing industry in all regions of Canada.
Minister, very quick answer.
Very quick answer. And I agree entirely. It is very important that the voices of fish harvesters are heard. When I was fisheries minister, had an excellent relationship with the FFAW. They were always very constructive in the workings and the dealings I had with them, and I'm always very happy to have conversations with them going forward.
Thank you. Colleagues, Minister, thank you for coming today. It's great to have you, and we hope to see you again. And thank you, officials. Minister, you are released from today's meeting. Colleagues, if I could ask just a few minutes of your time very quickly on some administrative items. I think it will take a minute or two just to go through these. Colleagues, earlier today, the clerk had sent out some budgets, and is it the will of the committee to adopt the study budget for Bill C-50? Any objections? Yes, thank you. Is it the will of the committee to adopt the study budget for Bill C-49? Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you. And colleagues, is it the will of the committee to adopt the travel budget for Bill C-49 in the amount of $108,500? We passed. Thank you. Thank you for that, colleagues. And I just want to welcome our full-time now new clerk and analyst to the committee. They've done a tremendous job. Our analyst has to finish off the last year, and our new clerk did a tremendous job today in preparing for Bill C-49. So thank both of you for your hard work and the hard work you're going to do in advance ahead. Thank you. This meeting is adjourned.